On the first death anniversary of my son, my daughter-in-law, whom I had not seen for an entire year, walked into the mansion carrying a newborn in her arms, declaring that this was the last bloodline of my only late son. She pushed the infant into my hands and coldly demanded a share of the $750 million inheritance. The room fell into silence as the weight of her words sank in. I looked down at the child in my arms, a tiny face wrapped in soft fabric. I felt the eyes of everyone pressing against me, waiting for a furious outburst, waiting for me to scream or cast the baby aside. Instead, my lips curved into a faint smile that unsettled more than a shout ever could. I held the child gently, rocking it as if I were the grandmother they expected, while inside my chest burned a fire of truth. I already knew who this baby belonged to. I knew the shameful bond that had created him. Around me, I heard whispers rising from the relatives who had gathered for the memorial. Some gasped at the sudden appearance, others exchanged knowing glances, and yet no one dared to step forward. My daughter-in-law stood straight, her chin lifted, her eyes filled not with grief but with calculation. I steadied my breath and asked quietly why she had not come to see me during the long year of mourning. She shrugged and said she had been busy preparing for the future of her child. Her tone carried no warmth, only entitlement. I traced the child's tiny fingers with my own trembling hand, hiding the storm that raged inside me. My heart remembered the man my son had been, his laugh, his kindness, and the secret he had carried silently. He could never have fathered this child. She mistook my silence for hesitation. "You cannot deny your grandson," she pressed. "This baby is the rightful heir, and the trust must be opened." I met her gaze at last, a small smile curving my lips, not of acceptance but of knowledge. The relatives froze in their seats as if the air had been pulled from the room. Eyes darted from the infant in my arms to the proud stance of my daughter-in-law, then back to me as if waiting for a cue. Whispers began to ripple across the hall, first soft and hesitant, then louder with each breath. Some leaned closer to each other, covering their mouths, murmuring questions about where the baby had come from, why no one had seen her pregnant, whether this was truly the blood of our family. A cousin gasped that the child had my late son's nose, while another scoffed that all babies looked alike. The clash of opinions hung heavy, feeding a storm of doubt. An aunt clutched her pearls, shaking her head, muttering that fate had blessed us with a miracle heir. Her husband shot her a sharp look, clearly unconvinced, and whispered that something about the timing made no sense. In the corner, my younger brother stood with arms folded, his expression unreadable. Yet his eyes followed the stepbrother of my daughter-in-law with a scrutiny that sent a chill through me. I sat motionless, letting their words swirl around me like wind through broken glass. The child shifted, letting out a soft cry, and for a brief moment all whispers died. The fragile sound cut through the tension, and many faces softened as though an innocent cry was enough to make them forget suspicion. My daughter-in-law seized that moment, her voice ringing firm, saying the family should celebrate the continuation of the bloodline rather than question it. I stroked the baby's tiny hand, whispering words only I could hear. "You deserve better than this cruel beginning. You were not born out of love, but out of hunger for fortune." The thought made my stomach tighten, but my face remained serene. Around me the murmurs continued, yet I floated above them, already planning the path that would one day expose the rot hidden behind their polished masks. One day when the evidence was laid bare, the very people who whispered now would recoil in horror at the revelation that this innocent life was used as a weapon by two souls too blinded by greed to see their own depravity. My smile was not joy, but a mask. I watched my daughter-in-law shift uneasily, as if she sensed something behind my calm. Her brother-in-law stood too close, his protective stance betraying more than any denial ever could. They thought they had crafted the perfect lie, a story stitched together with papers and forged results, but they had underestimated the patience of a woman who had buried her only child. Patience had become my armor, silence my blade. I lifted my gaze slowly, meeting the eyes of the family, then resting on the mother of this child. My smile widened just enough to let her know that I was not deceived, that I had seen through the veil. She paled, but quickly forced her chin higher. Let her pretend. For now, I would wait, because truth always finds its way back into the light. I leaned back slightly, letting the chatter of the room fade into a distant hum as my mind wandered to the roots of everything at stake. The company was not just a business. It was the lifework of my late husband, who in the early 1970s had started with a small kitchen and a dream to bring refined flavors into American households. He had worked tirelessly, building from one storefront to a network of suppliers, then expanding into restaurants and eventually into a corporation that caught the eyes of investors. Over decades, the company grew, listed on the stock exchange, spreading across oceans until its name became known in cities far from where it began. Today, the family's stake alone was valued at $750 million. That number hung like a jewel above everyone's heads, sparking greed and envy in equal measure. By the terms of the trust, I was named trustee after his passing. It was not only a duty but a shield, giving me control to manage and to protect what he had built. The clauses were precise. Assets would only pass to a legitimate heir, or else remain under my stewardship, to be directed toward charitable foundations and legacy projects. My husband had believed in structure, in leaving no room for chaos, yet he had also believed in me. His confidence gave me strength in moments when the vultures circled. I remembered the countless board meetings, the sharp men in suits who underestimated me until they saw I could read a balance sheet faster than they could blink. As I looked at the child in my arms, the contrast struck me. My husband's legacy was discipline, perseverance, integrity. What now threatened to claim it was deceit wearing the mask of bloodline. The fortune was never meant to be bait for schemers. It was meant to be a foundation that would outlast us all. 1 year ago, the memory of that night still clawed at me as if it had only just happened. My son had been driving back from a business trip across state lines when the call came. The officer's voice was clipped, professional, yet the words shattered my world. There had been an accident. His car had veered off the highway, slammed into the median, and spun before crumpling like paper. They told me it was instant, that he had not suffered, but a mother always imagines the last breath, the last fear in her child's eyes. The report later stated that the brakes had failed, a mechanical malfunction, they said, yet even then something inside me refused to believe it was mere chance. He had been the primary beneficiary of the family trust, the rightful heir to his father's empire. The clauses were clear. Should he pass without a legitimate child, the shares would remain under my stewardship, guided either toward charitable ventures or carefully chosen legacy projects. I had read those documents countless times, each word a safeguard to ensure stability, yet never had I imagined I would live to enforce them. $750 million remained untouched, suspended in legal limbo, a treasure locked away while grief became my daily companion. In the months that followed, I sank into silence, nursing my sorrow in empty rooms filled with his laughter's ghost. It was only when she appeared, my daughter-in-law, cradling a newborn and claiming him as the last bloodline, that the sharp edge of suspicion cut into my morning. She knew the trust, she knew the conditions. With one bold move, she placed a child in my arms and demanded the gates of fortune be opened. The memory of breaks that had mysteriously failed returned with a weight I could not shake. Perhaps fate had not been the driver that night. Perhaps hands unseen had guided the wheel. For 3 long years of marriage, my son and his wife had tried to build the family he always dreamed of, yet each attempt ended in disappointment. I remember nights when he sat at the kitchen table, his head bowed into his hands, whispering that perhaps he was cursed, that perhaps fatherhood was never meant for him. I would place my hand on his shoulder and remind him of his worth, telling him that children are blessings but not measures of a man. Still, the strain wore on him. The laughter that once filled their home grew thinner, replaced by tense silences and sudden arguments behind closed doors. I pretended not to hear, but every raised voice cut through me. His wife often arrived at family dinners with a forced smile, her eyes scanning the room to gauge pity or judgment. Relatives whispered about clinics, about treatments, about the pressure of continuing the bloodline of a vast fortune. My son brushed off their comments with polite nods, but I saw the way his hand clenched under the table. It was not only the weight of expectation, it was the wound of a man who carried a secret pain no one else knew. Despite the failures, he never stopped trying. He bought small toys for children of friends. He knelt to tie a cousin's shoelace. He lingered over cribs displayed in store windows. The longing in his gaze was unmistakable, and it pierced me each time. He wanted to give love more than he wanted to receive it. That was the kind of man he was. Now, as I held the baby presented to me by his widow, I thought of all those years of yearning. The cruel irony was almost unbearable. He had prayed for a child, yet the one placed in my arms was not his. That truth turned my sorrow into a quiet, burning resolve. After the funeral, when the house was still heavy with silence and the scent of lilies lingered in every room, I opened the small safe that my son had kept locked in his study. I had hesitated for days, afraid of what I might find, yet something stronger than fear pushed me forward. Inside lay his personal papers, neatly folded, as if he had hidden them not from the world, but from himself. Among them I found a medical report dated years earlier, stamped by a clinic he once visited after a sports injury in his youth. My eyes ran across the lines, each word sinking like a stone into my chest. The diagnosis was clear: permanent infertility. The damage had been irreversible, a cruel reminder of a reckless accident on the field. I sat back in his leather chair, the report trembling in my hands. My son had carried this secret alone, protecting his pride and shielding us from pity. I understood suddenly why he had brushed aside questions about children, why he forced a smile at family gatherings, why he drowned himself in work whenever conversations grew too personal. He had chosen silence over confession, and that silence had become his armor. My heart broke for the boy who never shared his burden with his mother. The truth left no room for doubt. The child now pressed into my arms by his widow could not be his flesh and blood. No papers, no forged results, no dramatic entrance could rewrite this fact. The moment I saw that report, the puzzle shifted, and suspicion hardened into certainty. What stood before me was not a miracle heir, but a carefully staged deception. I closed the safe gently, whispering a promise to my late son. They will not steal what you built, not with lies and not with the innocent face of a child who carries another man's blood. Back in the present, on the solemn day of my son's memorial, the quiet air of mourning was torn apart when my daughter-in-law reached into her sleek leather bag and produced a folder. With a triumphant smile, she laid a birth certificate on the table, followed by an envelope that held what she claimed was a DNA test. The bold letters stated a positive match, declaring that the child she carried was tied to my bloodline. Her voice rang clear and firm as she demanded that the trust be unlocked and the inheritance transferred. She spoke as though the matter was beyond dispute, as though my authority as trustee was nothing more than a door she could simply push aside. Before I could form a reply, another voice entered with rehearsed confidence. A young lawyer stepped forward, his polished shoes striking the marble floor with authority. He introduced himself as her counsel, insisting that the child's rights must be honored. I recognized him at once. He was not merely her attorney. He was her stepbrother, the son from her stepmother's earlier marriage. There was no blood relation between them, no shared lineage, yet he had always hovered near her with an eagerness that felt out of place. His sudden appearance now, brimming with determination to secure her claim, carried a weight that was more than professional duty. It was the fervor of someone who had a personal stake in the outcome. The relatives shifted uneasily, their eyes moving from the documents to the young lawyer, then to me. Aunts whispered about the miraculous timing, uncles frowned at the intrusion, and cousins exchanged puzzled looks. All waited for my reaction, but I gave them none. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, letting the room fill with their assumptions. Inside, my mind worked swiftly, recalling fragments of suspicion, strange investments, unexplained closeness. This display of papers and bold words was not truth but theater, and I had no intention of playing the role they had scripted for me. My silence was deliberate, more powerful than any denial I could voice. Their eyes gave them away long before their words did. As the young lawyer spoke with unusual energy, I noticed the way he and my daughter-in-law kept stealing glances at each other. The looks lasted just a little too long, carrying a familiarity that had nothing to do with legal work. My mind pulled back to the funeral a year earlier. In the middle of all the grief, I had caught a moment that felt out of place. He had stood very close to her, his hand brushing against her waist before he quickly pulled it back. It was far too intimate for two people who were only step-siblings, with no blood connection at all. At the time I ignored it, blinded by my loss, but now the memory returned with new meaning. The truth started to fit together piece by piece. Months before my son's death, my forensic accountant had given me a report. He found that my daughter-in-law had quietly invested a large amount of money into a shell company. On paper, the company was owned by a nominee, but the real owner was her stepbrother, the same man now speaking as her lawyer. I remembered asking her why she would put millions of dollars into such a small law firm with no reputation. She smiled and said it was just an investment for the future. The answer had sounded too smooth, as if she had practiced it beforehand. No one pours that kind of money into something so small unless there is a personal reason, unless there is a bond much deeper than appearances suggest. As I sat there, I felt the weight of certainty. Their alliance was no coincidence. It was a partnership built in secret, hidden behind money, and now shown to the world under the mask of family loyalty. Around me, my relatives whispered in confusion, but I had already stepped into another silence. It was a silence where truth sharpened itself inside me, waiting for the day it would strike and reveal them for what they really were. In the first year after my son's marriage, I stumbled upon something that unsettled me, though at the time I forced myself to look away. On the vanity table lay a birthday card, written in a bold, slanted hand. The words were short but heavy with intimacy. To my dearest, from R. There was no full name, no clue beyond that single initial. Next to it sat a small box tied with a silk ribbon, inside a set of expensive lingerie, delicate and provocative. I remember standing frozen, the card trembling in my hand, wondering who R could be. A relative, a friend, a business contact? Yet the gift itself spoke louder than the letter. It was not something given in innocence. Now, looking back with sharper eyes, I knew what I had once ignored. R was not just any letter. R was Richard, the name of her stepbrother. I told myself to forget, to bury the thought deep under the duties of daily life. Grief, celebrations, and obligations crowded in, making it easier to dismiss that strange discovery as meaningless. But now, as I sat surrounded by their claims of proof, the memory returned with sharp edges. That single letter R echoed in my mind, casting a shadow over every glance and every whisper I had ignored. The picture grew darker when my thoughts drifted back to the night of the accident, to the officer's words about failed brakes. Failed, they had said, as if fate had chosen. But what if fate had nothing to do with it? What if that failure had been carefully engineered, hidden beneath the mask of tragedy? At the next family meeting, one my daughter-in-law herself insisted on arranging, the air was thick with tension. She arrived dressed in sharp elegance, holding the baby like a trophy, and made sure every relative was present. Questions came quickly from uncles and cousins, skeptical about the sudden heir, but every time she faltered, he stepped in. Her stepbrother Richard spoke for her as if rehearsed, cutting off doubts with legal jargon and carefully chosen phrases. His protective tone was far too personal, his eagerness to shield her too sharp to pass for professional duty. I watched them closely. The way her eyes darted to him for reassurance. The way his hand brushed the papers before sliding them toward her. It was not the behavior of a detached lawyer. It was the rhythm of two people bound by something deeper, something they believed they had hidden well. Then came the moment that pierced the room. Richard reached for the baby, lifting him from her arms with practiced ease. He smiled down at the child, his voice warm but careless, and said the words that slipped out before he could catch them. Our son. Oh, I mean, the grandson of the family. The correction came too fast, too awkward, leaving behind an echo that no one could ignore. For a heartbeat, the room froze, relatives glancing at one another with wide eyes. Some whispered, others stared in silence, while my daughter-in-law's face stiffened, her smile cracking like porcelain. I felt the world slow around me, the truth flickering in plain sight. A father's slip is hard to disguise. That one phrase revealed more than any forged document or polished speech. I lowered my gaze to hide the fire that rose within me. They thought themselves clever, thought their web tight enough to bind me. Yet in that careless moment, the mask had slipped, and I knew the path to their undoing had just begun. My daughter-in-law recovered quickly, forcing a brittle smile across her lips, and raised her chin as if daring anyone to challenge her. With a practiced calm, my daughter-in-law declared that the child was indeed my son's, conceived through frozen sperm he had preserved years before. She spoke with conviction, spinning the tale as if it were truth written in stone. She said my son had taken the precaution after an old injury, storing samples in case natural conception failed. The story rolled smoothly off her tongue, each detail crafted to quiet suspicion. Relatives shifted uneasily, some nodding as though reassured, others whispering in doubt. She pressed on, her tone dripping with feigned sincerity, painting herself as the dutiful widow fulfilling her late husband's wish. But I heard the cracks in her words, the hesitation masked as confidence. I knew my son. He had never stored anything, never taken such measures, because he had lived with his pain in silence rather than confess it to anyone. Her story was built on what she thought I did not know. She underestimated me, mistaking my quiet watchfulness for ignorance. I studied her carefully, the way her hands gripped the table edge too tightly, the way her eyes darted toward Richard as if seeking silent approval. It was all performance, a fragile play meant to cover the truth. Around us, voices rose in debate, some praising her resilience, others murmuring that something felt wrong. I cradled the baby gently, rocking him as though I believed every word his mother had just spoken. My lips curved into a faint smile, the kind that relatives read as forgiveness, but inside I carried only steel. I knew the story was false. I knew the child in my arms was no trace of my son, yet I would not reveal my certainty too soon. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon is patience. Let them think they had convinced me. Let them think the gates of fortune were close to opening. Only then would their own arrogance betray them. As I studied the boy's face, my heart ached not with recognition but with absence. His eyes held none of my son's warmth, none of his familiar light. The shape of his mouth, the curve of his nose, the soft line of his brow, nothing mirrored the child I had raised. Every feature reminded me not of my blood but of another man who stood too close, whose presence lingered around every lie. The truth burned behind my calm expression, but I kept it hidden, sealed like a secret drawer only I could unlock. The relatives leaned in, cooing and whispering about the miracle of life. Some even claimed to see resemblances, eager to believe in continuity, too frightened to face suspicion. I nodded, feigning agreement, letting their illusions build a wall of noise around us. My daughter-in-law watched me closely, searching for cracks, but I gave her none. After the family meeting ended, I withdrew into the quiet of my study, my mind sharper than ever. Their performance had been bold, but every act leaves behind traces. I called on a private investigator I trusted, a man who had served my husband years ago. Without hesitation, he agreed to begin. Within days, he managed to collect a strand of the baby's hair, careful and discreet, and sent it to a lab for a grandparent DNA test. I waited in silence, knowing that science would soon confirm what my heart already knew. At the same time, he dug into hospital records. What he uncovered only deepened the shadows. The security cameras told a story louder than any testimony. There was Richard, my daughter-in-law's stepbrother, walking beside her to every appointment, his hand guiding her through the doors as though he were a partner, not a relative. He signed forms, paid bills, and his face appeared again and again in the waiting areas. No husband, no family friend, no one else. Only him. And when the day of the birth arrived, it was Richard who carried her bag, who signed every document as guardian, who wheeled her into the delivery ward. The final image cut deepest. Richard cradling the newborn against his chest, kissing the child's forehead before escorting them out. Each detail was a blade, slicing through the lies they had woven. They believed forged papers would convince the world, but a camera has no loyalty, only truth. I sat in the darkness of my study, watching the footage on the small screen the investigator had delivered, my hands folded tight. The pieces were aligning, each fragment of evidence forming a chain too strong to break. The next piece of the puzzle came from the forensic accountant, a man with eyes sharp enough to see through smoke and mirrors. He sat across from me in the study, spreading out documents like pieces of a crime scene. His voice was calm, but every word struck like a hammer. He explained that my daughter-in-law and Richard had been moving money through what appeared to be an art investment network. They bought paintings with little or no real value, obscure works from unknown artists, then had them appraised at absurdly high prices by friendly evaluators. Once the inflated value was on paper, they sold the same paintings back and forth between their shell companies, each transaction recorded as though it were legitimate profit. The cycle created clean money out of nothing, washing away the origins of funds that had no rightful claim. The accountant slid a file toward me, pointing to transfers that led directly to galleries overseas, each one tied back to Richard's firm. He had built a web of nominee accounts, layering the money until the trail grew faint, but not invisible. In the end, the plan was simple. Once they gained control of the family shares, they would funnel the $750 million through the same system. Within months, he said, the fortune would appear as clean, legally documented income, ready to be withdrawn and spent without question. I sat in silence, my chest tight, as he laid out the steps like a blueprint for theft. It was not just greed, it was engineering, a long game of deception designed to erase every trace of wrongdoing. Yet their arrogance was their weakness. They thought no one would look deep enough. No one would notice how worthless paintings suddenly carried million-dollar tags. But here it was, in black and white, undeniable. I closed the folder slowly, my resolve firming. They had turned art into a weapon, but the weapon would soon point back at them. When the time came, their empire of lies would collapse, buried under the very evidence they thought no one would ever see. The final blow came when I turned to the evidence surrounding my son's accident. For months I had carried the officer's words in my chest, brakes failed, as though it were fate. But now, with experts by my side, fate was no longer part of the equation. A mechanical specialist examined what remained of the wreck, his hands tracing the fractured metal like a surgeon uncovering truth. His report was blunt. The bolts that held the braking system together had been tampered with, loosened just enough to survive a short drive, but destined to give way under pressure. It was no accident, he said. It was sabotage. The words chilled me, yet they also ignited the clarity I had been seeking. At the same time, the investigator unearthed footage from a nearby traffic camera. The grainy images showed the garage where my son had left his car the day before the crash. In the corner of the frame stood a man, his shoulders rigid, his face caught in a brief glance toward the camera. Richard, my daughter-in-law's stepbrother. He had no reason to be there, no connection to the garage, yet his presence hung over the scene like a shadow too heavy to dismiss. He was there when the car was vulnerable, when only a skilled hand could prepare the silent weapon that would later take my son's life. I watched the footage over and over, the truth searing itself into me. It was not the hand of chance that had stolen my son. It was calculation. It was betrayal carried out with surgical precision. My grief twisted into something sharper, colder. They thought the world would accept the story of failed brakes, but the camera and the mechanic's words told another story. And that story was mine to reveal when the time was right. I let the mask of frailty settle over me like a second skin. In front of my relatives, I sighed often, my shoulders curved as though the weight of grief had hollowed me out. When my daughter-in-law pressed harder for her claim, I did not fight with open fire. Instead, I let my voice tremble. I let my eyes moisten, and I whispered that perhaps the trust was too heavy for me to carry alone. That was all the encouragement she needed. Believing she had broken my defenses, she rushed to file a lawsuit, convinced that victory in court was certain. What she did not see was the net already tightening. My lawyer had quietly secured subpoenas from the court, formal demands for records that no banker, gallery director, or hospital administrator could ignore. These papers reached into vaults, archives, and files that they thought untouchable. Bank statements revealed the flow of money into shell companies. Gallery invoices showed impossible valuations for worthless paintings, and hospital documents listed the guardian who had signed every form on the day of the child's birth. Each record was a piece of steel in the chain that would bind them. I played the role of the weary widow, speaking gently, even thanking her for seeking clarity through the courts. She mistook my politeness for surrender. What she never understood was that public court is not a stage for lies, but a furnace that burns away disguise. When her complaint was stamped and filed, the process could no longer be hidden. The courtroom would summon the witnesses, demand the records, and record every contradiction. By pretending weakness, I had guided them into the one arena they could never control. Soon, the truth would not only be mine to hold, but the world's to witness. The day of the trial arrived, and the courthouse steps swarmed with cameras, microphones, and flashing lights. Relatives filed into the gallery dressed in somber colors, friends whispered in tight clusters, and the press waited eagerly for a scandal worthy of headlines. Inside the courtroom, the air was electric with anticipation. My daughter-in-law sat at the plaintiff's table, her hair styled flawlessly, her lips painted in a confident shade of red. She carried herself as though victory were already written, glancing around with a smile that bordered on triumph. Beside her sat Richard, her stepbrother, polished in his tailored suit, his expression calm but sharp, ready to deliver the performance of his life. When called to the stand, he spoke with rehearsed authority, weaving a narrative about a grieving widow, a miraculous child, and a fortune that rightfully belonged to the next generation. His words were smooth, measured, and designed to tug at sympathy, while my daughter-in-law nodded along, occasionally dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief. But I saw the cracks. Each time a difficult question came from the judge, Richard paused half a second too long, his gaze shifting sideways as if reaching for a script no longer in front of him. His tone grew sharper when pressed, and he leaned too heavily on technicalities rather than truth. The jury watched closely, their pens scratching notes with every slip. My daughter-in-law, so radiant at the start, began to shift uncomfortably, her smile faltering as if she sensed the ground beneath her heels was not as solid as she had believed. Around us, whispers rippled through the benches, reporters scribbling furiously, their eyes darting between the witness stand and me. I remained still, my hands folded neatly, my face composed. The storm was gathering, and I knew the time was coming when their web of lies would collide with the evidence waiting in silence, sharp as a blade. Richard placed the documents on the judge's desk with a flourish, as if each sheet were sacred proof beyond challenge. The birth certificate bore my late son's name, neatly typed, the ink unblemished. Alongside it lay the DNA report, stamped and signed, announcing with clinical certainty that the baby carried his blood. My daughter-in-law lifted her chin proudly, her voice steady as she declared that the trust must now be opened, that $750 million rightfully belonged to her child. Murmurs spread through the courtroom, some eyes softening with sympathy, others narrowing in doubt. The judge studied the papers in silence while reporters leaned forward, pens poised, hungry for a headline. I sat motionless, my face unreadable, though inside I felt the sting of insult. They believed forged ink and purchased science could erase truth. They mistook silence for weakness. I folded my hands in my lap, letting the moment stretch, knowing that every false document they presented would soon become the rope that tightened around their necks. I rose slowly from my chair, letting the silence of the courtroom wrap around me. My lawyer slid a thick folder across the table, its weight a promise of truth. With calm hands, he opened it, page after page laid before the judge and jury. The first was my son's medical file, signed by specialists, stating in unambiguous terms that he was infertile due to an old sports injury. A murmur rippled through the benches. The forged DNA results now trembled in the shadow of medical fact. Next came the grandparent DNA test, conducted in secrecy. The report was clear. No biological link tied the child to my bloodline. The air grew tense, my daughter-in-law's painted smile faltering, her hand clutching the table edge. Then my lawyer presented documents from the fertility clinic. Their records showed no deposit, no storage, no frozen samples in my son's name. The story of preserved sperm collapsed into dust before the court. The screen lit up with hospital surveillance footage. Richard appeared again and again, escorting her to every appointment, signing every paper, paying every bill. The final clip froze the room, Richard holding the newborn, pressing a kiss to the infant's forehead before carrying him from the neonatal ward. Gasps filled the chamber, some relatives covering their mouths, others staring in disbelief. A gesture far too intimate for a stepbrother. The attack did not stop there. The accountant's report surfaced next, tracing millions through worthless paintings appraised at impossible prices. Each invoice, each transfer, each gallery receipt laid bare a laundering scheme meant to wash the family fortune clean after theft. Finally, the mechanic's report landed like a blade. Bolts from the braking system deliberately loosened, a diagram of sabotage, and the traffic camera image of Richard near the garage the day before the crash. The judge leaned forward, his expression darkening, while the jury scribbled furiously. I stood still, letting the storm unfold, my heart steady though heavy. They had tried to bury me under lies, but truth is a fire, and once lit, it spreads fast. The mountain of evidence spoke louder than I ever could, and in that moment, the room no longer looked at me with pity. They looked at me with recognition, seeing not a broken widow, but a guardian who had brought the truth into the light. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the weight of the evidence crashed down. My daughter-in-law's voice cracked into a shrill wail, tears smearing her carefully painted face. She clutched the table, crying out that it was all lies, that she was the victim of a cruel plot. Her sobs rang hollow, desperation spilling out in a torrent that no longer moved the crowd. Relatives who once looked at her with sympathy now turned away in shame, unwilling to meet her eyes. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicking as if capturing the very moment her mask shattered. Richard tried to salvage control, his tone turning sharp, his words slicing through the air with denial. He insisted the money transfers were standard legal transactions, that the footage was taken out of context, that the kiss on the child's forehead was nothing more than affection. But the prosecution laid out the bank ledgers side by side, every dollar traced to his accounts. The video replayed again on the screen, frame by frame. His signature scrawled across hospital forms, his face bent over the newborn. Each denial collapsed under the cold clarity of evidence. The judge pounded the gavel, demanding order, but the truth had already spread like fire. The jury's pens moved without pause, their expressions grim and unmoved. My daughter-in-law's cries grew weaker, dissolving into broken gasps, while Richard's voice rose in angry protests that sounded more like panic than reason. The walls of their scheme closed in, leaving no escape, no excuse strong enough to undo the trail they had left behind. I remained still, my hands folded, my gaze steady. For months they believed I was powerless, a woman too fragile to fight. Now they faced a truth neither their tears nor their arguments could erase. The court saw them for what they truly were, and in that moment, justice began to breathe. The courtroom fell silent as the judge adjusted his glasses and read the verdict aloud. His words carried the weight of finality, each sentence striking like a gavel against stone. The child, he declared, held no legal right to the inheritance. The forged birth certificate and falsified DNA test were officially dismissed, their value reduced to nothing more than criminal evidence. A hush swept through the room as the implications settled. The family trust, the empire built through decades of sacrifice, remained secure under my stewardship. Then came the charges. My daughter-in-law's face drained of color as the judge listed them one by one: fraud, fabrication of genetic evidence, conspiracy to commit grand larceny, pending investigation into vehicular sabotage that had resulted in the death of my son. Each word struck her like a stone, her shoulders trembling, her hands twisting as though searching for something to cling to. Once she had walked into my home demanding power. Now she stood exposed as a criminal, her empire of lies dismantled in public view. Richard fared no better. His license to practice law was revoked on the spot, the judge's voice cold as he announced it. Charges of conspiracy and money laundering through art transactions now bound him tightly, the web of shell companies and inflated valuations laid bare for all to see. He tried to remain composed, but his jaw clenched and his hands shook as the gavel echoed across the chamber. The man who once carried himself with arrogance now looked small, cornered, and stripped of dignity. The final moment etched itself into history. Officers stepped forward, their handcuffs glinting under the fluorescent lights. My daughter-in-law let out a strangled cry as the cold metal closed around her wrists. Richard's protests grew frantic, but the officers silenced him with firm hands on his shoulders. The flash of cameras filled the room, capturing the image of the two of them led away in chains. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward, their voices merging into a storm of noise. The photographs would appear within the hour, spreading across news outlets and social media, their downfall recorded for the world to witness. Relatives who once doubted me now sat in stunned silence, some lowering their eyes, others shaking their heads at the spectacle. My friends reached for my hand, their grips warm with unspoken solidarity. I did not smile, nor did I weep. I simply sat still, watching as justice carried them out the door. Their names, once whispered with ambition and entitlement, would now forever be tied to scandal, deceit, and disgrace. And in that moment, I felt no triumph. What I felt was resolution. The empire my husband had built, the trust I had guarded remained intact, but the true victory was not in wealth preserved. It was in the truth unveiled, in watching deception collapse under the weight of its own greed. Karma had arrived, not with whispers, but with iron cuffs and headlines that would never let them forget. The house was finally quiet, the echoes of the trial and the storm of the crowd fading into memory. I sat on the porch, the evening air cool against my skin, and poured a glass of red wine. Before me the roses bloomed in brilliant color, their beauty untouched by greed or betrayal. I lifted the glass, watching the petals sway, and felt the weight of both victory and loss. I had preserved the inheritance, I had stripped away the lies, yet the absence of my son remained a hollow space no justice could fill. The newspaper on the table caught the last of the sunset's glow. Courtroom exposés, heiress fraud, and art laundering ring. Their names, once whispered with ambition, now screamed across headlines, their disgrace immortalized in ink and broadcast. Justice had found its way back, burning through every falsehood. Still, as the world turned its gaze to scandal, I sat in silence, knowing that truth carries both triumph and sorrow. I leaned back, breathing in the stillness, and whispered to myself, "Power and lies may hide the truth for a time, but justice always rises. Age does not strip a woman of her worth. It makes her a fortress of wisdom, of strength, of quiet resilience. If this story has touched you, share it. Let it be a reminder that women, even when underestimated, can hold the final word, and that in the end, truth always finds its way home."